The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The forest seemed to breathe, its ancient lungs exhaling a mist that clung to everything it touched. Each step Emily took was muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves, their decay a testament to the passage of time in this untouched wilderness. The towering trees, their branches interwoven like the fingers of giants, created a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. A lone cabin nestled amongst these towering trees, its windows dark and foreboding, stood as a beacon of eerie silence in the vast wilderness. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Its wooden walls, which had once provided comfort and security, now seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a cage of her own making. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood and the distant call of a night bird. Inside, Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, each frantic beat echoing the danger closing in. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the forest pressing down on her. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the cabin a harbinger of doom. She was alone, isolated, with no one to turn to and nowhere to run. She was trapped, her safe haven transformed into a cage. The windows, once portals to the outside world, now felt like the bars of a prison cell. She could see the forest outside, its dark, twisted branches reaching out like the fingers of a monster. The cabin, which had once been her refuge, now felt like a tomb. She was a prisoner, held captive by her own fear and the unseen menace that lurked outside. A low growl, barely audible, sent chills down her spine. It was a sound that spoke of danger, of a predator lurking in the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat, her body tensing in response. She knew that sound, had heard it before in her nightmares. It was the sound of something hunting her, something that would not stop until it had her in its grasp. It was him. She could feel his presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on her. He was out there, watching, waiting. She could sense his eyes on her, feel his breath on the back of her neck. He was a shadow, a ghost, a nightmare come to life. And he was getting closer. Every second that passed brought him nearer. His presence a dark cloud that threatened to engulf her. He was toying with her, a predator stalking its prey. He enjoyed the chase, the thrill of the hunt. She was his quarry, and he would not rest until he had her. The forest was his domain, and she was an intruder. He knew every tree, every rock, every shadow. She was at a disadvantage, lost in a maze of fear and confusion. He was the hunter, and she was the hunted. Emily's breath hitched, her mind racing, desperate for an escape, a way out of this nightmare. She scanned the room, looking for anything that could help her. A weapon, a hiding place, a way out, but there was nothing. The cabin was a trap, designed to keep her in and him out. She was running out of time, her options dwindling. She had to think, had to find a way to survive. But the woods whispered their secrets, offering no solace, only the chilling promise of a confrontation she couldn't avoid. The trees seemed to mock her, their branches swaying in a silent dance of death. The forest was alive, a living, breathing entity that conspired against her. She could feel its malevolence, its desire to see her fall. She was alone, trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. The only way out was through, and she would have to face her fears head-on if she wanted to survive. He had been watching her, she realized, his eyes like ice, reflecting the moonlight filtering through the trees. The forest was a silent witness to the unfolding drama, its shadows concealing secrets and fears. The moonlight cast an eerie glow, making the trees look like ghostly sentinels. Emily could feel his gaze piercing through the darkness, a predator stalking its prey. The night was alive with the sound of her own heartbeat, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. Each calculated step he took towards the cabin echoed in the silence, a harbinger of the terror that was to come. The isolated cabin stood like a lone sentinel in the woods, its wooden walls a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. His footsteps were stealthy, almost inaudible, but to Emily, they were as loud as thunder. Each step brought him closer. Each step tightened the noose of fear around her heart. Each creak of the floorboards beneath his weight tightened the knot of fear in her stomach. The sound was a cruel reminder of his presence, a signal that he was near. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her body tensed with dread. The dim light cast eerie shadows on her face, highlighting the terror in her eyes. She knew she had to stay silent. Any noise could give away her hiding spot. Emily pressed herself against the wall, her back stinging against the rough wood. The splinters dug into her skin, but she didn't dare move. The pain was a small price to pay for staying hidden. She could hear his breathing now, slow and deliberate, a hunter savoring the chase. The wooden wall was her only shield, a flimsy protection against the menace that lurked just beyond. He knew she was here. His eyes scanned the room with a knowing look, a predator confident in his hunt. The dim light played tricks with the shadows, but he was not fooled. He moved with a purpose, each step calculated, each movement deliberate. The ominous figure seemed to blend with the darkness, a shadow among shadows. He was close, too close. The silence between them was a living thing, pulsating with unspoken threats and a growing sense of dread. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that screamed of danger. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. The room was a battleground, the shadows their only witnesses. The tension was palpable, a thick fog that enveloped them both. Emily's hand trembled as she clutched the small knife, her only weapon against the darkness that had seeped into her sanctuary. The knife was small, almost insignificant, but it was her last line of defense. Her fingers were white with the pressure of her grip, her knuckles aching. She knew it was a pathetic defense, but it was all she had left. The knife was a symbol of her desperation, a last-ditch effort to protect herself. It was a pathetic defense, but it was all she had left. The small knife seemed almost laughable against the looming threat, but it was her only hope. Emily's desperate expression mirrored the hopelessness of her situation. She was alone, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The knife was her lifeline, a fragile thread in the darkness. She knew she had to be strong, had to fight, but the fear was overwhelming. The hunter was closing in and she was running out of time. The cabin door creaked open, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed through the still night, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with the very essence of fear. Each creak of the old wood was a reminder of the isolation, the remoteness of this place. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, breathing, waiting for what was to come. He was inside now, his silhouette a menacing shadow against the faint moonlight. The darkness seemed to cling to him, wrapping around his form like a shroud. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, creating a dance of light and dark that only heightened the sense of dread. His presence was overwhelming, a dark force that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a deafening drum that echoed in her ears. Her eyes were wide, unblinking as she stared at the figure before her. She wanted to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as if she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Fear, raw and primal, pulsed through her veins. It was a fear unlike any she had ever known, a fear that reached deep into her soul and took hold. She could feel it in every fiber of her being, a cold, unrelenting terror that threatened to consume her. Her hands clutched at her chest as if trying to hold herself together, to keep from falling apart. He spoke her name, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down her spine. It was a voice that she had heard before, a voice that haunted her dreams. Each syllable was a dagger, cutting through the silence and piercing her heart. She could feel the weight of his words, the malice behind them, and it made her blood run cold. Each word was a taunt, a reminder of his power over her. He reveled in her fear, took pleasure in her pain. His eyes gleamed with a sinister light, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He knew that she was at his mercy, that she had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and he enjoyed every moment of it. Emily fought against the urge to scream, to run, to give in to the terror that threatened to consume her. She could feel the scream building in her throat, a primal cry for help that she knew would go unanswered, but she couldn't give in, couldn't let him see her break. She had to stay strong, had to find a way to survive. She had to be strong, had to find a way to survive this night. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the fear. She knew that she couldn't let him win, couldn't let him see her fear. She had to find a way to fight back, to take control of her own fate. The night was long and the darkness was deep, but she was determined to see the dawn. He circled the room, his footsteps measured and deliberate, a hunter savoring the chase. Emily tracked his movements, her eyes wide, her senses on high alert. He was playing with her, trying to break her, to strip away her last vestiges of control. His words dripped with false concern, a twisted mockery of comfort. He wanted her to believe he was doing this for her, that he was saving her from something far worse. But Emily saw through his lies, saw the darkness that lurked beneath his carefully constructed facade. A floorboard creaked behind him. He stiffened, his head snapping towards the sound. For a fleeting moment, Emily saw a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. It was a chance, however small, to escape. Adrenaline surged through her veins, pushing back the fear. She had to act fast, had to use his momentary distraction to her advantage. Emily's hand tightened around the knife, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. This was her only shot, her only chance to survive the night. The primal instinct to flee warred with the desperate need to fight. He turned back to her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He knew. He had been toying with her all along, but it was too late. Emily lunged, her small knife a blur in the darkness. She felt it connect, felt the resistance of flesh and bone. A surprised grunt escaped his lips as he stumbled back, his hand flying to the wound. He roared in pain and fury, his eyes blazing with rage. The game had changed. He was no longer the predator toying with its prey. He was wounded, angry, and out for blood. Emily knew she had only bought herself a few precious seconds. She had to get out of the cabin, had to get help. But the woods were vast, and he knew them far better than she did. Still, she had to try. She had to fight for her life. She sprinted towards the back door, her lungs burning, her legs screaming for respite. The sounds of his enraged shouts followed her, urging her onward. Emily burst through the door and into the darkness, the cold night air stinging her lungs. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. The woods were a labyrinth, but she pushed on, driven by fear and adrenaline. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent her heart into overdrive. He was out there, somewhere in the darkness, hunting her. Dawn found her huddled beneath a fallen log, miles from the cabin, her body battered and bruised, her clothes torn and bloodied. She had survived the night, but the ordeal had left its mark. The police believed her story, the evidence at the cabin too damning to ignore. But the man who had terrorized her was still out there, lost somewhere in the vast wilderness. Emily knew she would never be truly free of him, not completely. The scars he left ran deep, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting to claim her.